Problems of American democracy. The separation of powers. In the United States of America, government is divided into three branches: the executive, home of the president and cabinet; the legislative, home to Congress; and the judicial, home of the Supreme Court of the United States. The U.S. Constitution outlines these three branches, and they are kept separate from one another to prevent any one branch from abusing its power. It works like this: the executive can veto bills from Congress, the legislative can remove Supreme Court judges, and the legislative can declare executive actions unconstitutional. And it goes in reverse: executive has checks on the judicial, judicial on the legislative, and the legislative has checks on the executive. But how is this a problem to democracy? The issues are thus: the separation of powers, also known as checks and balances, does not fully allow for Americans to control and hold accountable their government. The current state of checks and balances allows for a system of government whereby one branch can control another, and standstills can occur. The first issue is the separate elections of the President and Congress and the congressional midterm elections. A president can be voted in with or without the majority support from Congress. In a presidential election, which ties in with congressional elections, this is less likely to occur. When the president and a majority of Congress share a party, the executive can recommend bills and the legislative can pass them, allowing the executive to enforce new legislation. This is what the recently elected president and members of Congress promised to their voters. In this situation, the government is by the people, for the people. However, the issue arises when the president and a majority of Congress don't share a party, which can occur after the midterm elections. Historically, the president loses party seats in the midterm elections to the other party. Depending on how many seats were controlled by one party following the presidential elections, the midterm elections run the risk of resulting in a president belonging to one party and a majority of Congress belonging to the other. This is where the checks and balances becomes a hindrance. As opposite parties with different ideals and views, the president faces the challenge of a hostile Congress that will block any attempts made to introduce legislation, and the Congress faces a president who has the authority to veto legislation passed by the opposite party. Congress can pass legislation unfavorable to or against the president's party views and election promises, with the President of the United States running the risk of unpopularity in the polls if too many vetoes are used. Whilst it was a legislative by the people, a two-party controlled system of government does not allow Americans to control and hold accountable their governments. Election promises are made in return for votes, but under a two-party controlled system of government, voters can find it difficult to hold their representatives and president accountable for action or inaction. Representatives of the majority party in Congress can shift the blame onto the president for an opposing stance and vetoes, whilst the representatives of the other party and the president can shift blame onto the opposite party-controlled Congress as justification for legislation not passing and election promises being undelivered. So, is there anything that can be done about this problem? A possible solution is the abolition of the midterm elections and instead have representatives serve 4-year terms. This not only gets rid of the midterms, which have been shown to lose the president's seats and sport a lower voter turnout, but also allows representatives more time in office to deliver on their election promises without worrying about spending a large portion of time campaigning for their seat when they could be working on enacting new legislation. However, this is only one possible solution to the much